The storm has begun. Not tomorrow, not next week, not someday in the distant future. No, beloved, the winds are already roaring, the earth is already shaking, and the eyes of the world are turning toward one place, one city, one name, Jerusalem. You may have seen the pictures, the protests, the declarations, but let me tell you something louder than the news, deeper than the headlines, more lasting than the panic. What you're witnessing right now is prophecy in motion. What you're hearing is the sound of the clock of heaven ticking toward fulfillment. And what you must understand is this: Israel is not just another country. She is not just a place on the map. She is not just the subject of headlines. She is the centerpiece of divine promise, the heartbeat of God's plan, the stage of redemption, and the spark of the world's final confrontation. There, in the land of covenant, the people are rising up. Masses are crowding the streets. Tel Aviv is rumbling with voices demanding change. And from across the sea, a voice speaks not in whispers, but with weight. Former President Donald Trump posts an image. A crowd, a cry, a call for peace. It's now or never, they say. End the operation, sign the deal, cease the fire. But Israel does not move. And while one leader shares a plea, another sends a warning. From the podium of the United Nations, the King of Jordan raises his voice. He condemns the movement on the Temple Mount. He calls it dangerous, inflammatory, provocative. He speaks of a faith-based crisis ready to explode. He warns the nations. He urges restraint. And within Israel, discontent bubbles. Outside her gates, pressure mounts, and yet the silence of Jerusalem speaks louder than the clamor of nations. For what the world cannot see is what the Word already declared. God said there would come a time when Jerusalem would become a burden too heavy for the nations to bear. Not a light matter, not a trivial dispute, but a stone so weighty, any who try to move it will wound themselves in the attempt. That's what's happening now. Every alliance once trusted is trembling. Every relationship once secure is shifting. Even the strongest ally grows silent, uncertain, conflicted. And Israel, oh Israel, she begins to look not to the left or to the right, not to the east or to the west, but upward. And that, my friend, is the purpose of the pressure. That is the aim of the isolation. To strip away every earthly support so that the only place left to look is God. Don't you see it? This isn't about headlines. This isn't about elections. This isn't about peace treaties or diplomatic gestures. This is about prophecy. This is about destiny. This is about a covenant that was written not in ink but in blood, not on paper but on the pages of eternity. Israel is not facing random trouble. She is walking a narrow road laid before her from the beginning. She is being pressed by the hands of men, but positioned by the hand of God. For when all the nations gather against her, not some, not many, but all, that is not the end. That is the beginning of the glory to come. Oh yes, the world thinks it's closing in. They think they're forcing her hand. They think they're pushing her into surrender. But heaven is smiling, because the more men plot, the more God prepares. The more pressure rises, the more his presence descends. And when the nations gather with rage and arrogance, the King of Kings will step onto the battlefield and show the earth whose land it really is. They call it Palestine. They call it disputed. They call it occupied. But God calls it mine. He doesn't need to take a vote. He doesn't wait for a resolution. He doesn't ask permission. He already decreed it. He already established it. He already called it holy. And when he speaks, no man can silence him. Jerusalem, the city of the great king, is not a pawn on the world's chessboard. She is the crown jewel of heaven's kingdom. And though the world tries to divide her, the word declares she is indivisible. Yes, beloved, the Al-Aqsa compound, the Temple Mount, they are not just pieces of geography. They are sacred ground. They are the place where God once dwelled, the place where the glory rested, the place where the blood of sacrifice cried out for mercy. And in the last days, they will once again become the center of the storm. The nations rage over stone and soil. But what they do not know is that their war is not with Israel, their argument is not with Netanyahu, their fight is not with soldiers or governments, their war is with God. Because when you touch Jerusalem, you touch the apple of his eye. And the moment you lay your hand on the covenant, the hand of judgment begins to rise. That's why no peace plan will last. That's why no treaty will hold. That's why the world keeps trying and failing, because you cannot forge peace by ignoring the Prince of Peace. You cannot write solutions while rejecting the author of the story. So let the protests roar. Let the leaders speak. Let the cameras roll. Let the kings and rulers take counsel together. It is all part of the setup. It is all part of the plan. And when the pressure reaches its peak, when Israel stands with her back against the wall, when every ally has turned and every voice has faded, then God will move. He will pour out a spirit of grace. He will open eyes that were blind. He will touch hearts that were hardened, and a remnant will rise. Not just political, not just cultural, but spiritual. A remnant will rise and say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." That's the promise. So I ask you, are you watching with earthly eyes or with prophetic vision? Are you reading the news or reading the Word? Are you listening to the panic of men or the plan of God? Because what's happening in Jerusalem is not just history. It's prophecy. It's not just war. It's worship. It's not just conflict. It's covenant. And the question is not what the nations will do. The question is, what will you do? Will you stand with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Will you bless what he blesses? Will you declare peace when the world shouts war? Because the line is being drawn, and in the days to come, you will have to choose. As for me, I choose the covenant. I choose the cross. I choose the city where the king will return. I choose to bless Israel. I choose to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. I choose to trust the word that never fails, because kingdoms will fall, empires will crumble, headlines will fade, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now, hear me, Israel is not being dismantled by men. She is being positioned by God. The alliances she once trusted now tremble. Public support wavers. Internal voices demand surrender. But no matter how loud the pressure, Jerusalem must not bow. For the prophets predicted not an Israel surrounded by allies, but an Israel surrounded by opposition. They said the nations would gather. They said Jerusalem would become a stone that crushes those who try to move it. They said the day would come when Israel would stand alone, yet standing. That day appears to be here. You see, the world does not hate Israel for her success. They hate her for her covenant. They despise her because she bears the sign of God's promise. They oppose her because she is part of his redemptive story. And when you oppose Israel, you oppose a people God has marked with purpose. The pressure intensifies now in multiple dimensions. Politically, nations push for deals, incentives, compromises. Religiously, control over sacred sites, access to worship, definitions of holiness. Socially, protest, media campaigns, shifting public opinion. Spiritually, the battle beneath the surface. Each tactic is not random. Each move is targeted. The goal is to break Israel's resolve, to force compromise, to reposition the covenant to the table of diplomacy rather than the throne of God. But the moment Israel begins to lean on treaties more than trust, she loses her footing. The moment she thinks man will save her, she forgets God is the one who sustains her. This is the spiritual trap behind the headline. They push for peace. They push for surrender. They push for sharing, not because it's fair, but because it weakens the foundation. Let me remind you, God said, I will pour out upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of grace and of supplication. In that very generation when pressure peaks, God promises revival. He promises tears. He promises turning. He promises remnant. He promises power. Yes, in the darkest hour, grace will fall, and supplications will break through, and the remnant will call, here is our God, we waited for him. That is where history pivots. So while the world converges in opposition, Israel turns upward. She cries not for political favor, but for spiritual visitation. She looks not to the courts of men, but to the courts of heaven. She seeks not compromise, she demands covenant. She prays not for deals, she pleads for deliverance. Beloved, this is not just a moment for Israel. This is a moment for the church. This is our invitation to stand with Zion, to intercede when others speak, to pray when others shout, to believe when others panic. The remnant that rises in these days will not waver. Their faith will not falter. Their voice will not bow. Let the nations rail. Let the voices pressure. Let the snares set out. But we who know the end of the story, we stand unmoved, because we know the King is coming, because we know the covenant cannot fail, because we trust that heaven's design trumps earthly descent. So lift your eyes, lift your hearts, stand in the gap. Pray for Zion. Declare her walls unshaken. Speak that no weapon formed shall prosper. Speak that Israel shall not fall. For though the nations gather, God's plan is intact. Though the storms roar, the covenant remains. Though the world rages, Jerusalem still stands. Amen. Beloved, do you hear what is happening beneath the chaos? The roar of the crowds is but a veil. The real fight is for the ground of worship. Jerusalem's hills are trembling not just with footsteps, but with spiritual conflict. Sacred ground is under siege. The Al-Aqsa compound, the Temple Mount, these are not merely stones and soil. These are altars of destiny, thresholds of covenant. And in this hour, they become the stage of spiritual warfare. Men speak of rights, access, sovereignty. They argue about who may pray, who may enter, who may reign. But the heart of the matter is not access, but allegiance. Not real estate, but relationship. Whose worship will stand, whose priesthood will prevail. Repeated incursions, rituals beyond agreement, prayers where they should not stand. These acts are not carelessness, they are accelerants. They are prophetic signals. They are tools being used to provoke, to test, to edge closer to the moment when worship is no longer optional, it is demanded. Understand this. When Jerusalem becomes the focus of worship conflict, the nations gather. When access is contested, the veil is torn. When temple ground is challenged, the sky begins to open. Because God is jealous for his house, he will not allow false worship to sit long without correction. The ground where he once dwelled still pulses with destiny. Israel faces not just political condemnation, she faces a trial over worship. And when that trial comes, the world will watch. The nations will demand rights. The voices will demand parity. The world will say, let them share, let them access, let it be inclusive. But the Word says the holy cannot be common. Beloved, those entering when they should not, they are not making peace. They are staking claims. They are invading the sacred and asking to be legitimized. But God allows that. He has allowed that in the last days so the remnant's eyes would open, so that every compromise becomes a test, every step into the sanctum becomes a warning, every plea for unity behind the altar becomes a snare. And those who push the envelope of worship will not be satisfied with incursion. They will demand control. They will demand authority. They will ask not just to pray, but to dictate what is worship, how it is worshiped, whose name is lifted. The ground of the Temple Mount will become the epicenter of final rebellion and final worship. Israel must stand firm. She must not retreat in the face of pressure. She must not concede holiness for harmony. She must refuse to redefine the sacred, because if she loses worship, she loses identity. If she surrenders the altar, she surrenders her covenant. And you, the church, must pray. Pray for Jerusalem's holiness to be defended. Pray for wisdom to discern those who carry rope into the sanctuary. Pray that the remnant's eyes will see deception in worship. Pray that worshipers in Zion will not bow to compromise, but cling to covenant. The nations rage over land, but God's war is over worship. The men push for rights, but God demands loyalty. The crowd demands access, but God demands purity. So stand firm, Zion. Lift your voice not in fear, but in faith. Declare, this ground is consecrated, this altar is not negotiable, this city belongs to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When the nations threaten, Jerusalem must not show fear, she must show fidelity. Hold your worship as much as your walls, because in the days to come, to bow at the wrong throne will cost souls. To worship at the altar of politics will forfeit covenant. To trade worship for agreements will bring ruin. But those who endure, those who remain, those whose hearts will not be compromised, they shall be found holy in the day of the Lord, and their worship will rise across the rubble. Amen. Don't mistake this time for mere diplomacy. This is the pressure cooker before the explosion. Israel is being beckoned, cajoled, pushed to the brink of compromise, and the offer will not sound evil. It will sound appealing. It will wear the clothes of peace. It will promise relief. It will claim stability. It will speak of unity. Watch closely, the calls will come to relinquish control of Jerusalem, to permit shared access, to alter worship authority, to compromise on sanctuary rights. They will call it progress. They will call it peace. They will call it understanding. But under the surface is a snare. The nations will press Israel to give back so that she may move forward. Go. They will demand that she loosen her grip on the sacred so that deals may be crafted. They will argue theology, archaeology, history, all to force her hand. But remember, earth's treaties cannot stand against heaven's covenants. Men's words cannot uproot God's promises. The one who owns the land cannot be persuaded by those who only rent it. They will say, let's rezone holy sites. Let's permit new worship. Let's adjust boundaries. They will talk of fairness, access, equality, but fairness that invades the altar is theft. Access that alters the standard is contempt. Equality that ignores sanctity is betrayal. Israel will find herself cornered. She will face choices. No nation wants trade parts of Jerusalem for peace, relinquish sovereignty for safety, yield worship rights for treaties. These are not offers, they are tests. Tests of loyalty, tests of faith, tests of covenant. Behold the spiritual dimension. The enemy is not asking because he believes, he is demanding because he deceives. He knows that when peace is offered at the price of obedience, many will sign away their souls. He knows the hunger in a war-torn people. He knows the cries for respite. He knows that when you offer a pact in the middle of a battlefield, people will lay down arms and sign anything for the illusion of rest. But the Word warns, don't call it peace when it's a facade. Don't call it calm when it's a lie. When they promise protection in exchange for compromise, beware. When they demand the holy be diluted for the earthly good, refuse. When they urge worship be reinterpreted to serve politics, resist. Because once you trade worship for treaty, you have surrendered the very reason the land was called sacred in the first. You have moved the battle into the sanctum. You have opened the door for the deceiver to step in and say, now I too will worship. Now I too will reign. This pressure is not optional. It is inevitable. The forces arrayed against Zion will not stop until the altar is changed or the faithful stand. They will demand compromise until the walls cry for blood. They will negotiate until the covenant's contours are erased. But God whispers, stand, do not bow, do not yield, do not dilute, do not retreat. In the pressure, you become pure. In the trial, your resolve is refined. In the fight, your identity is sealed. Israel must hear. Refuse to surrender worship. Refuse to barter holiness. Refuse to redefine the sacred. Let no treaty rearrange God's design. Let no political voice demand her knee before the throne. And you, believer, listen well. Pressure will come to compromise your principles, your faith, your convictions. They will whisper, for peace, yield this one thing. They will argue, for prosperity, surrender this doctrine. They will threaten. If you do not adjust, you become isolated. But the cost of compromise in Zion is not political, it's eternal. The price is not territory, it's identity. The sacrifice is not land, it's loyalty. So stand. Lift your voice. Declare, we will not betray the altar. We will not redefine the sacred. We will not yield worship for treaties. When the nations press, when the voices demand, when the leaders negotiate, let Jerusalem hear this from her faithful. You will not bow. You will not capitulate. You will not betray your God. For though the fires of pressure may scorch, though the voices may rage, though the world may scream for surrender, the walls of Zion will not yield. The altar will not bend. The covenant will not break. Amen. We are now stepping in to what I call the narrowing road. The path where compromise no longer has room to roam. Where pressure becomes prophetic and crisis becomes covenant. Where the world's noise fades and God's voice breaks through. Israel will continue to be compressed. The space for diplomacy will shrink. The days of easy decisions, grand alliances, and comfortable peace will be over. She will be forced into position to either surrender to the world's terms or stand on God's covenant. That is the narrowing. Already the voices are louder, calls for shared governance, shared worship, shared authority. Western nations call for fairness. Regional powers demand inclusion. Media demands compromise. Internal voices push for pragmatism. But the covenant says, Jerusalem belongs to me. The word says, no weapon formed against her shall prosper. The Spirit whispers, Do not barter Zion. In the narrowing, Israel will be asked to exchange not just land, but spirit, to exchange sovereignty for survival, to exchange worship for accommodation, to exchange holiness for harmony. That is the snare. A covenant on paper is cheap. A covenant in blood, the covenant God made with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David, is eternal, and no temporal treaty can override it. As Israel is pressed, smaller deals will be proposed. Incremental concessions, agreements behind closed doors, silent compacts traded in shadows, each one a thread pulling her toward compromise. Each one a test. Will she surrender the ground of the soul to preserve the ground of the state? The narrow road forces a choice. Will Israel walk by the world's logic or by God's revelation? Will she lean on alliances or lean on the Almighty? Will she capitulate under pressure or cry out under the covenant? Beloved, the narrowing is not merely Israel's battle. It is the church's invitation. The narrowing is where the remnant is tested. The narrow path will separate the casual from the committed, the superficial from the steadfast. You will be told, compromise for peace, relinquish for stability, silence the prophetic voice for comfort. But remember, compromise made on earth will be judged in heaven. In that narrow road, worship will fall first, then doctrine, then identity. The world will praise the deal. They'll call it wisdom, but the Word calls it betrayal. So what must Israel do? What must God's people do? Hold the ground of Zion unwaveringly. Refuse to barter access for authority. Protect worship from negotiation. Preserve the holiness of the city, even when the world demands its surrender. And the church stand with her. Pray for the walls. Intercede for the courts. Speak integrity when the crowd demands compromise. Remain vigilant when the world offers relief. Resist the siren call of peace that costs your soul. For in the narrowing, choices define destiny. Covenants hold or crumble. Identities form or erode. And only those who stand in covenant will stand when the storm passes. So walk the narrow path by faith. Watch with prayer. Speak with courage. Love with grace. And let your loyalty remain unmoved even when every voice screams otherwise. Because the narrowing leads to the place where God's hand breaks hostage chains, where His presence bursts forth, and where Zion's walls become the stage of His glory. Amen. Now, listen, the final turn is near. Israel will be pressed. The nations will rage. The alarms will sound. The walls will shake. The voices will demand. The compromise will intensify. And at that moment, when all semblance of hope seems gone, God will intervene. He does not wait for perfect conditions. He does not step in after human rescue fails. He steps in when the world looks most like victory for the adversary. He moves into the vacuum left by men. He speaks into the silence left by nations. In that final turn, we will see the remnant of Israel rise with clarity. A mass of people return with tears to the God of their fathers. Worship restored in the sacred places. Prophets crying out again in the streets. Judgment falling on those who gathered against Zion. This turning point is the hinge on history. It snaps between human failure and divine triumph. Israel will stand not by human strength, but by God's miracle. She will speak not by political rhetoric, but by prophetic power. She will prevail not by armies, but by covenant. And as God moves, the earth will quake, the heavens will burst, the nations will bow, the deceiver will fall. History will pivot at that moment. Time will bend. The old order will shatter, and the new kingdom will rise. Beloved, the final turn is not for the weak, it is not for the timid, it is for the watchful, the faithful, the resolute. Will you stand in that hour? Will your faith not falter? Will your worship not waver? Will your identity not sway? Because when the nations rage and the walls crumble, only those rooted in covenant will remain. So watch, pray, stand, and be ready for the turn when God steps in and all ends are undone. Amen.